Greetings and welcome to our final panel of the day, Cosmic Comedy. We're going to be looking at random moments of comic relief in the grimmest of tales to out-and-out farce. But before that, we're going to do the results of the cake raffle. So we're going to ask our guest of honour here, Mr. Stross, can you have a good old rummage, sir?
Just one? Right, yeah. Okay, here goes. And the winner I have just picked up, if I can actually read it, is number 173. Does anyone have number 173?
My tickets are on my table, so I don't know.
Wasn't me.
Yeah. So, should we just crack on then?
Yes.
Yeah. Righty-ho. Yeah, I'll get our guests to introduce themselves first. Should we start on this end over here? Yeah, Tom.
Is that on? Oh,
yeah.
There we go.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Thomas Campbell. I am the writer for a comic series called Abyssal Albion, which is a post-apocalyptic Lovecraftian tale set within the UK. I also have recently found myself writing cosmic horror smut, which is great, along with two of my panelist friends here. And I also write and produce horror films as well, having written a couple of cosmic horror shorts that aren't that funny, but are, in a way.
I'm Charlie Stross, and as it used to say on my social media bio line, I tell lies for money. I think that goes for most of us here. And yeah, I'm... Sorry, corpsing here. I have written quite a lot of stuff over the years, some of which isn't actually funny, but the Laundry Files in particular has had a vein of dark humour running through it ever since the very, very beginning and the paperclip audits, and the random bureaucracy, and the human resources attacks. Stuff is just recomplicating, getting more and more comedy-oriented as I fall further and further out of currency in the IT trade. So I've got to make up for it somehow.
Rob?
Hi, I'm Rob Poyton. I'm an author. Also produce a couple of podcasts with my associate here, a musician. My one claim to cosmic horror comedy fame is having a story printed in the Nookie-Nomicon, I think. I shall draw a discreet veil over that.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Zoe Burgess. I write, draw, podcast on queer cosmic horror and monster erotica. I am basically your friendly local monster fucker.
I can't follow that. I'm Tim Mendees. I'm an author of various random scribblings. I still don't know whether this was a compliment or not. My work has been described as the love child of H.P. Lovecraft and P.G. Wodehouse. And yeah, I think it was actually meant as a criticism, but it's now splashed all over everything that I write. So I'm running with that. Righto. So first off, tell me a bit about how comedy plays a part in your work, or like in Zoe's case, or in podcasting, things like that. And how did it come about? Was comedy a conscious decision, or did the jokes just creep in by some weird osmosis? Because with me, I was raised on carry-on films, so it just kind of happened. They weren't supposed to be comedic. They were supposed to be really, really sort of serious and po-faced and dark, but people were laughing at them, so it's well, I guess I just have to run with this. Right, so we go to Tom?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I guess I never set out to write comedy elements in any of the stories I write, to be fair, but I tend to try and do things as bleak as I can, but I think you get to such a bleakness, you need something to uplift, to break up that sense of horror. I mean, if it's just horror all the way through, then, it loses momentum and it just gets a bit like, okay, I now know something scary is going to happen, something scary is going to happen. So it's kind of, it's that whole, you kind of put you unsettle people by putting like a little bit of humour amongst the horror, because that's like, oh, you don't expect it there, and then you go right back to the horror, and that's when it's, oh my god. But yeah, I guess, so I find it just naturally enters. I don't consciously do it, but yeah. Anyway, I'll pass on.
Okay, I want to draw a distinction between comedy and humour. At risk of getting a bit serious here. Comedy, you want to go back to the ancient Greeks, their idea of comedy was it is uplifting, it is not necessarily, it is cathartic, it gives you an idea of, it is the antithesis of tragedy. Tragedy, those who aspire too high get smacked down by the gods. Comedy, those people who don't necessarily aspire too high, may have wacky fun adventures and still get smacked down by the gods, but in a humorous way. But comedy is one thing, humour is something else. Humour is a contrast medium. A lot of what we think of as actual fiction genres are nothing of the kind. Rather, they are tints or washes that we apply to fiction, and they can be mixed and layered. You can have humour, horror, or romance as tints added to any other genre. You can apply any of them to, for example, a spy thriller or science fiction or a mainstream novel, and you can mix and match. You can do a romance in a horror novel just to add zombies. You can do humour on top of romance. In fact, that's an entire genre that Hollywood have colonised. It's called the rom-com. You can do humour on top of horror. And what happens when you do that is you have moments of amusement to leaven the bleakness in between before we dive back into it, as has been noted. Yeah. And they're two flavours that go really, really well together, like caramel and a bit of salt.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a really good analogy, actually. Right, Rob?
I think there's three areas here. One is writing intentional comedy, which for me generally revolves around puns and bad jokes. So, for example, in the Nookinomicon, my story about Colan the Barbarian, he came up against the wizard. The wizard had a guard dog. Do you know what breed it was? An abracalabrador, of course. So there is that level of humour, if I can call it that. I think the second thing is when writing a story, there is the natural humour that the characters might emote. Now, that might be normal everyday stuff, or it might be, I'm sure, as any of you know, people who work in services or certain types of job, they develop a certain type of humour, sometimes to deal with what is going on. So there is that humour that comes from the character. And I think then the third one is that what we might call the Conte cruel, where we see in writers like Clark Ashton Smith or Dunsany, that cruel little ironic twist at the end of the story. I think the other week we were talking about the Horde of the Gibelins, where the guy goes in to steal the treasure from the Gibelins, and they capture him, and the last line is, "This isn't one of those stories with a happy ending." You know, it's a grim situation, but it's got that humorous slant on it. So for me, it's those three approaches.
So I'm a great believer that in the whole, like, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. So whenever I'm dealing with tragic events, or whenever I'm like, so I don't write comedy in my horror novels. It's such like I don't write a comedic scene, but characters and through myself will have situations which they will start recounting as if it's the funniest thing ever, because if they don't recount it that way, they'll be like, oh Jesus Christ, this is awful. Because that's how I deal with anything my side. I like to laugh at my trauma. So my writing would also laugh at that because it's a coping mechanism. And then when I'm not doing that and I'm writing like erotica stuff, like it's the absurdity. I think these things are funny because it's so freaking like weird. I mean, I come from the hentai scene, and half the hentai I watched wasn't actually sexy. It's hilarious because by the time, you know, someone's being like, oh no, I'm the Lovecraftian demon with penis fingers, and you're like, this has stopped being erotica now, and this is just silly. And I don't know if I'm supposed to be laughing at this, but I'm sorry, your space willies are funny to me.
Again, I can't follow that. No, we see tons of comedy, sci-fi, horror movies and things like that. You tend to see it mixed together humour used more in TV. Because a lot of the big TV series will have comic characters or moments. I mean, even in like things that we've covered on the Monster Erotica podcast, we'll have a random moment, which we'll get to in a moment. So why do you think that comparatively there's so little of it in horror literature? I will start with... Do you want to take that first, sorry?
I mean, I can do. I mean, obviously my literature background is very, like, different.
Yeah.
But... So, like, I just feel that, like, when people want to be writing, like science fiction and horror, they don't want to lose it with the comedy, so people take it seriously. They want people to have a level of, like, fear continuously, like, throughout. So if I'm writing proper horror, sarcasm will slip in because the character is trying to mask the fact that they're shitting themselves with humorous joke, but they don't want the tone to start getting funny because then you stop taking it seriously. And then you start getting into the realms of the other stuff that I like, where it's the monster's got funny by the point that, like, it's gone the erotic way. So I feel like that's a real big thing, to make sure they don't lose that tension. But then, as I say, we've watched, like, a lot of films on my podcast, and it'll be a completely serious film, and then there'll somehow randomly be, like, a granny in it that's acting groovy, even though they're in a demonically possessed church, and you're like... Wait a minute, what just happened then? Like, so it can really take you out of an immersive experience if something is a bit too funny and randomly funny within the story.
Can I grab this and show the counterpart?
Absolutely.
There's a counterpart, though, which is you have something that looks like humour and is funny at first, then smacks you on the face with some existential body horror. Yes. And that's a really good way of ramping up the horror effectively. It's a contrast medium.
Yeah.
I think in terms of literature specifically, I can think of two possible reasons why there's less comedy in horror. First is it's very difficult to pull off well. I think writing good comedy, for me, is the most difficult thing. That's why I write very bad comedy. Without making it seem forced or, descending into parody or something. So that is a very difficult thing to pull off. And I think the second thing possibly is it comes back to when we were chatting earlier about this idea of genres. This is a horror novel, you can't have comedy in it. There's perhaps that pressure to, if it's horror, it's got to be horror, if it's comedy, it's got to be comedy, if it's a romance, etc., etc. That blurring of the lines, which most creative people like to do, is not necessarily what publishers or whoever puts your work out wants you to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with that. Well, I like to use it as a counterpoint to try and enhance it. But yeah, I've had that with publishers saying, do we have to have this character saying this here? And it's like, well, yeah, because it's a very natural human reaction to say the gallows humour to something like that. So, yeah. Okay, passing it on.
Honestly, don't really have much to add to it. I think what you guys said is absolutely spot on. Certainly what Tim's just mentioned about having characters say things that I've had notes back regarding scripts saying, oh, would they say that? It's like, yeah, no, absolutely. That's a natural reaction. That's very natural in the way you speak. So, yeah, no, I fully agree. I don't really have anything to add.
Mr. Stross?
Only one thought to add, which is if we're talking about comedy as such, no discussion is complete without mentioning Terry Pratchett, the master of modern comedy, especially in genre work. Terry never actually tipped over and wrote a full-blown horror novel, but he was so obviously capable of doing it. I think he probably didn't do it because it would have been too off-brand.
Right.
But there's food for thought.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think we were saying last night in the bar, weren't we? We live in hope that there is one under a pen, under a pseudonym somewhere. So how hard is it to get it right? And what problems have you faced in your own work or seen from, from that side of things? Do you want to start on the end, Tom?
Incredibly hard. I find writing comedy or humour certainly is just absolutely, because it is so subjective, and you know, not everyone laughs at the same sort of thing. And I think when you're writing on your own as well, to what you might find funny, to not everyone will, and you doubt yourself a lot as well. Is this going to be funny if I put it down? And then you read about it, you laugh to yourself, you're like, oh no, I'll take that out. And I find it incredibly hard. It's probably, I'd much rather write like about people's lives falling apart than people having fun and dancing around. It's like, I don't know what that says about my own life, but you know, absolutely.
It helps to bear in mind there's at least multiple different angles from which you can approach comedy in fiction. One of them is the narrative viewpoint, the other is the protagonist's viewpoint. A tragedy is something extremely funny happening to somebody else. So you can portray the same event as either comedy or tragedy, depending on whether you do it from an omniscient third-person viewpoint, where, oh look, that guy over there just slipped on a banana skin and broke his neck, or from a point of view of the first-person point of view of the slippee who's just broken his neck. It's the same event. It can be done in two different ways for two different emotional impacts, and it's up to you, the author, to pick which one you want.
I think also so much comedy that we consume is visual. You can spend hours on YouTube looking at fouls, people falling off of ladders, dogs knocking people over, all that kind of stuff. And as you say, they're slipping on a banana skin. Almost everyone laughs if they see that, almost regardless of the consequences. You might feel bad afterwards. But if you write that down and describe it, it's somehow not as funny, unless you're an extremely good writer, perhaps. The real challenge is translating that visual effect into a written effect. Or with a written comedy, are you talking about sort of making jokes or a humorous situation? I was thinking of like farces, that sort of stuff, miscommunications and misunderstandings. So there's quite a lot of different strands to comedy, as many as there is to horror, right? Yeah. So it's like, which type of comedy are you trying to bring into your work or have an impact as well?
Yeah.
As I said, I'm not good at writing comedy. It is not my thing. I will use the sarcasm or the tragic humour for masking. The only time I ever do use it is if I want to humanise a monster character. Because if you're trying to make people believe that some guy wants to fall in love with an eldritch horror he found in the Mariana Trench, you've got to have somehow, hey, that is my story, and someone is going to love it one day. Yep. You're like, humour works as a way of humanising something, giving you, like, if you can make someone laugh, you can feel a connection to them. So that's the only time it ever really used, like, writing, and when something is, I want to try and something, get you to relate to, you know, the tentacle monster in the Mariana Trench.
Yes. Yeah.
No, I think you're spot on there. Because I mean, like I say, I never really planned it. I just kind of wrote people how I observe people. And I often find that people say and do the funniest things under moments of extreme stress. So to me, that was a very sort of naturalistic way of writing a character, because you know, you hit your thumb with a hammer. What's the first thing you do? You make a joke about it, don't you? Because to mask the fact that you're in extreme pain. So yeah, I think you're right there. And right, so as comedy is subjective, as is horror, yeah, I think that's another reason why it's so difficult to get right, because you're dealing with two very subjective mediums, aren't you? But have you ever gone too far and had to reel yourself in, or had moments where a beta reader or an editor just sort of went, what are you on? So I think we're going to start with you. We'll start with you, Charles.
Okay. I have an ongoing project I began in 2014 that isn't published yet. A space opera. It is awaiting its third rewrite, because it's difficult, because I'd set out to try and, you know, Ian Banks isn't writing culture novels anymore, so I'm going to try and colonise his space by doing something that isn't a culture knockoff, but feels like it should be. And that's overambitious. And it's not particularly humorous, except all good space operas need a carpet-chewing adversary. And was doing some reading in history, because history, as Ken MacLeod puts it, is the secret weapon of all science fiction writers. And I ran across a person who was so implausibly over the top that I had to tone him down in order to cram him into a space opera. And when I sent the first draft to my agent, she said, this needs work and it's pretty much solid, but you've got to take this character of the abbot out. Nobody will believe him. It was a toned-down version of a historical clergyman called Ignaz Trebitsch Lincoln, who died in 1943 when the Japanese secret police poisoned him at the express request of Adolf Hitler, who Trebitsch Lincoln had annoyed once too often. Trebitsch Lincoln was the only person to be a member of a German government and a British government in the decade of the 1910 to 1920. Yeah, he was in both, on either side of the First World War. He started out as a Jewish religious scholar, converted to Lutheranism because he wanted to get away from Hungary, was sent as a missionary to Canada and decided it was too cold. So took ship for England, charmed the Archbishop of Canterbury into giving him a curacy, and ran for Parliament while marrying a German shipping magnate's niece and trying to corner the Balkan oil market in 1911. Real person. I'm going to skip over some of the highlights, including him running a fascist information clearinghouse in Europe in the 1900s before he sold it to the Czechoslovakian secret police for far too much money. Things got too hot for him in Europe, so he ran away to China and became an arms dealer to 3 different warring warlords until they found him out. At which point he checked into a Buddhist monastery and converted to Buddhism. As a monk. Wait, 3 years later he pops up in Shanghai as Brother Abbot running his own monastery, convincing the sons of rich merchants to become monks, check in and give him all their money for safekeeping while he spent his weekends seducing nuns. In 1939, he declared himself to be the Dalai Lama. Solicited the support of the Japanese secret police and Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's secretary, and then Heinrich Himmler, to send in SS troops so he could invade and occupy Tibet. This was derailed when Rudolf Hess decided to broker a peace treaty with England without telling anybody and flew off to Scotland in 1940. But as you can see, this is a real person, and I have you all in stitches just giving a very abbreviated whistle-stop tour of the highlights of his insane career. You cannot top reality.
No, that's true. Yeah. Tom? There.
I can't remember what the question was. That was absolutely genius. Has anyone ever told? I've ever thought I've gone too far? No. Thankfully, I'm surrounded by people that are probably slightly sicker than me in the humour way, so I probably don't go as far as I should. I'll write something that I think is funny, and they go back and say, I often quite hold back on what I think, and they're like, no, you should really go for it. It's like, all right, we'll do that then. I think we're writing a cosmic horror feature film at the moment. One of my co-writers, Ben, over there, we've had so many back and forths, and he's just like, no, we should take it even further. And I'm like, so if anything, I'm probably the safer one out of the two of us. But yeah, no, I'm lucky because I've never had anyone come back and say, yeah, no, you've not taken it too far yet, which is great because I just know that, I could.
Yeah.
Rob?
I can't think of any examples in my writing as such, but I can think of quite a few examples when recording podcasts with a certain person, and normally one of us will say something like, rah, and the other one starts laughing, and it devolves from there. We say? We've got Lovecraft in the stars, we'll always drag it down to the gutter, basically.
Yes, yeah.
So there is a certain amount of editing goes on at times in the podcast. But,
Yeah.
I think that's it. We self-censor.
Yes, indeed, yeah. I think it's the same with us, isn't it?
I was going to say, if you ever listen to our podcast, our sense of humour starts going out the window, and then we have to be like, I'm not sure the average person is going to find this as funny as we do. Especially since, as I say, I'm from the erotica and, space tentacle monster like club. So, I mean, if you go, I've had it this weekend where people come around my table and they're like, oh, that's not a hotep. They seem to have their bum out and there's tentacle willies everywhere. And so I think I'm drawing wonderful things and I'm sniggering because bums are funny. And then like I've got Sexy Slender Man with his bum out on the table. But maybe I'm going too far, I'm not in the right audience because people will be like, oh, I wasn't expecting to see like Cthulhu with his bum on display. And I'm like, but bums are funny, I like it. Someone's going to like it, we'll find that niche.
The bum niche.
The bum niche.
Bums.
It's a market. It's a
Yeah, I
market.
mean, come on.
You go for the bum count.
Oh dear. Right, I'm going to think now of things that are definitely not comedy books. They're very, very serious things. But you will often find humour used as the counterpoint, as we've mentioned. Now, is there a danger of doing that? Because, obviously, again, it's subjective, isn't it? Is there a danger of diluting the emotional or dramatic scenes? And how do you think it can be enhanced? How can it be used to enhance rather than sort of destroy or detract?
You could do that for films.
Yeah, go. Do you want to take it?
It can distract if it's not done well. I find, okay, so a film we reviewed for our podcast, and a film I absolutely adore, is Spring. And obviously, Benson and Moorhead, amazing directors, love everything they were doing. I love it. And Spring, obviously, is this kind of, well, it's a monster erotica, like it's got all those like crafty tales. And we reviewed it and love it, but there's that one moment in the church where they're like, she's mutating and her eyeball is coming out because she's part octopus and they have to escape and some granny like turns around and goes, I just saw a zombie crack addict. And you're like, I've gone from like horror to beautiful romance to this random granny comedy, which seems to be a theme because we're on our third film that has random granny humour in like things like, you know, like the church and stuff. And I'm like, what's it with funny grannies and like cosmic horror and like monster romance? A weird thing all on its own. But I think the reason that a moment of like humour works in that situation is because sometimes humour can wrong foot you. Like when you're watching something and you're like really like scared and stuff and there's a funny scene, you're like, oh, well, that was funny. Oh, maybe, it's okay. And then blah, blah, blah. And you're like, oh, no, it wasn't okay. Because I suddenly had a sense of security because characters are cracking jokes. So clearly the danger has passed and I'm okay. Obviously, you can completely there go, where did that come from? I don't understand, and take you out of the experience. Or it puts you in that false sense of like, things are safer now. They're cracking jokes, and there's a humorous scene. The horror must have passed and we're okay, we can take a breather. And that's the perfect point to be like, no, here's something even more horrific will appear.
Yep.
I think in terms of writing and does it add or does it not, I think it's a question of is it consistent with the character, really? Does it seem very out of character? And I mean, people are generally, we're quite predictable, generally. Of course, people are capable of doing something very outlandish and very strange, perhaps, every now and again. But I think if you can work it in and it's consistent with the character, then it will always be at the right level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Over to you.
Non-fiction interjection here.
Go on.
Something that's very, very noticeable is certain professions have their own use of humour, and it's opaque to outsiders. I'm thinking particularly of medical humour, nurses to a lesser extent, but very specifically to paramedics and accident responders, police as well. They use humour as a distancing thing for defusing the immediacy of really hideous accidents that have happened to people, of finding a way to distance themselves and, if not make a joke of it, then at least lighten it enough that they can cope with it and don't have nightmares after the fact. And this is something that human beings actually do. I believe the military do it as well to some extent, with even more distancing, because, well, for the most part, the people who are having a really bad day are on the other side of the gun. But yeah, this is a very human reaction and can work well when depicted in fiction. If you've ever read any medical humour fiction, there's some really grim things happening that are the scores of much mirth.
Honestly, again, I don't have anything to add. I think that's absolutely, everyone's just nailed it on the head completely. I like what you said about obviously how certain professions have their way of dealing with it. I work with the military daily, and some of the stuff they come out with is absolutely horrifying. I love it. I totally get it. I find it the funniest thing, but then you realise where it stems from, and they're using it as a coping mechanism, and it's actually really bleak. And again, I love it.
Yeah.
On the sort of flip side of that, when you've got a book that is intentionally humorous, a comedy thing, how hard is it for those writers to get real for a moment, to actually get some emotional punch in it, to stop it just being out and out farce? Because that's something that when I have done that kind of story, that I set out for it to be intentionally humorous, I also wanted it to be horror, and I found it incredibly difficult. So I always go back to the film Shaun of the Dead, and there's the scene in the pub when the jukebox goes off, and you've got that slapstick moment where they're attacking zombies with the pool cue, but as soon as that jukebox gets mangled, things turn dark really quick. And I think that was a masterful way of turning on its head. So how hard do you think it is to get that right? Who wants to take that first?
I say it's very hard. It's like nigh impossible unless you know what you're doing. Like, I wouldn't be able to do that tonal shift as well. You see it in a lot of like films and media where the tonal shift doesn't work, but then you see it when it does it right. And then I mean, visual cues help, lighting, sound design when it comes to the cinematic. When it comes to the page, it's how well have you written those characters to realise that they're finally having a moment that they've cracked in the story and reality is sinking into their world. I think it's a lot of setup and staging before you can go from like, oh, we're all having a lovely time, to like, we're not really having a lovely time, to like, we need to breathe through this and be like, actually, we need to deal with some of this trauma before we can continue moving on and coping.
Yeah.
There's one classic example, though, of depicting this I can think of, that I think probably everybody in here is familiar with. The Mitchell and Webb sketch, Are We the Baddies?
Nice.
But there are little tiny skulls on our caps. And that's the thing, it's the moment of revelation. It is what William Burroughs called the naked lunch moment. That moment when you look at what's on the end of your fork and see it in all its gory detail. And that's what we're aiming for when you mix horror with humour.
Yeah.
I think to a large extent as well, it's knowing your audience, and the difficulty from a writer's point of view is you have no contact with your audience when they're consuming your art. I can think of good, if we're talking about comedies, there's very good stand-up comedians. I think of people like Bill Hicks, who can switch a mood in a room with a line or so, from something really funny to something quite dark and then back again. But they have the advantage of that immediacy with the audience. They can read the room, they can sense the mood. In written form, again, you don't have that connection. So I suppose that other than events like this, or you go to meet authors and authors meet their readers, that feedback is quite a different experience, I think. And from being a musician as well, as a musician, you have that direct feedback with the audience. And that can work in different ways. Mother, is that you, Mother? I'm getting a message. Brian, is there a Brian?
I thought it was Mort calling awesome.
But it's funny what you're saying there about the feedback. I think that's why, from a humour standpoint, doing the Nookie-Nomicon, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's Cthulhu Mythos stories in the style of Carry On films. And it was a stupid idea. So, and it was kind of like, right, I'm going to get some people involved in this. And because we did it as a group project, we had that feedback. We were shooting each other the stories, and I found that a hell of a lot easier to do, because we had that, you know, if he thought my pun was really bad, then it was a really bad pun and it was going in. So, you know, I wasn't just sort of, you know, screaming into the void with these things. I think that's what, like, having my partner as my beta reader is always useful, because she will turn around and go, no, you're an idiot, if I need to hear that, you know. So yeah, pass it over to you.
Oh God, yeah. I'm just too interested in what everyone else has to say. I can't even think about what I'm saying. Where were we? What was it? It was just.
How hard is it to get real in a humorous story, or book or film?
Yeah, I certainly in books. I don't really. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. I don't think it's. It is, I mean, I guess if you're writing a comedy and you need like a really serious thing, then it can be quite hard. We spoke about With Nell and I, and that's a hilarious film all the way. But then the ending is just so, yeah, it's quite dour and grim and bleak at the end. And that's definitely, I think that's the sort of comedy that I prefer. Is if you're going to do like a comedy film, have it all the way funny, and then. I love it when it just suddenly breaks and the tonal shift completely is just like, no. And I kind of like that in horror as well, in the reverse, like, like films like The Evil Dead, where it's just like, it's gore, but it's funny and there's like tonal shifts in that. Certainly in the Fede Alvarez one, everyone's like, oh, it's the most serious one. It's hilarious. Like, everything's over the top, but then there's some really silly, yeah. So I find it incredibly hard. I find comedy very hard.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back and trying to recreate from memory something that Nick Momatus said over a decade ago, American horror author and anthologist. And he was observing that it is almost impossible in horror fiction, which we read and write it for catharsis, for enjoyment. It is almost impossible to write anything that comes close to the actual true existential horror of a family gathered together around a bed in a hospital, where a member of a family is on a ventilator and they're trying to decide who gets to turn them off. And that's a real-world situation that happens to thousands of families every day, and yet nothing we write can actually come close to that level of emotional dread. Nor do we want it to, because what we're doing fundamentally is working in an escapist medium. We're reading it for catharsis, for the sense of having actually come through the gauntlet and survived. The true reality of life is that nobody gets out of here alive. Sooner or later, we're all going to die, and we're very probably going to die alone, and not in any great comfort either. It's hideously bleak when you stop and think about it. So what we do when we read horror is we're trying to actually get away from the reality of the true horror of life.
Yeah.
Righty-ho, we've got a little bit of time left, so we're going to ask some questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question? Oh, here we go. Here we go. Our resident improv comedy poet. Here we go.
Given that both comedy and horror thrive on subversion of expectation and messing with expectations and shock value, how far is too far for you on both counts?
Oh, goodness. It depends on your target audience. So it depends on your target audience. I'm up here writing tentacle horror porn. So sometimes far is very far, but there's a whole subsection of the world that is very much like hentai is not okay. It's not okay to be into that. So I've got to make sure that I'm pitching myself to my niche market, and I wouldn't be going up to I wouldn't be at MCM London going, hey family, do you want to read some tentacle erotica? Because I know that would be too far for them. So I think with comedy, you've got to know who you're kind of marketing to it, know a little bit about yourself and the audience you want to be tailoring your stuff to. So I know that for me, too far could be quite a lot further than what someone else might be doing, because not everybody thought La Blue Girl was funny while I did.
Yeah, I'd echo that and say really it's about knowing your audience, and the thing is everyone has different tolerances for things as well. People used to faint if they saw an uncovered piano lick, perhaps at one time in history, or someone's calf or something. So it's very difficult to... It's a very individual thing, I think.
Retracking, trying to remember where I was going to answer with this. I don't think we should self-censor. I think our readers have an almost infinite ability to put the book down and walk away if they're not enjoying it. It's not for us to do the job of a blue-nosed school library censors for them.
I think to comedy, certainly, I think it stops being funny is when you start punching down upon like minorities and people, that side of things. That's where I would probably draw the line. And similarly, when we were writing Eldritch Lust, one of the big things that we wanted from it was everything in there was consensual. Like, yeah, it's full of like tentacles putting things in various orifices and, but everybody loved doing it. They enjoyed it. They went out seeking that, I won't say that, whatever. But that, So, there are certain lines. I think we all generally have a sense of decency, kind of. As soon as you're like introduce things that aren't consensual, well, I guess that depends on where you're going. That's where I draw in the line. And once again, punching down, it's not funny.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. And I think for me as well, it has to, is what we said earlier, it has to be in keeping with the character. It can't be jarring, I think. But if I have a character who is a foul-mouthed docker, then they should be a foul-mouthed docker. Again, like Charles said, we shouldn't be censoring what this foul-mouthed docker would say, because then it's not realistic, is it, to that sort of character, I think. Right, I think we've got time for a very, very quick one. One last question, right? I'm coming. Got more exercise today than in the last, year.
I was just wondering, for each of you, sort of, what's your favourite sort of wait what moment? So what I mean is, when I was watching Fierce Creatures in the cinema for the first time, it's the John Cleese comedy based in the zoo, and there's that moment where they say, look, we can't rehouse these animals, you'll just have to kill them, and then it cuts out and all you hear are the gunshots, and then it goes to that point where there's the cages in front of the freshly dug graves, and me and my mate were laughing our heads off, and the rest of the cinema were looking round at us going, what? So, which sort of, any fiction, any medium, sort of, what was your moment of that when you're sort of laughing and everyone else is going, what?
Got one with a dodgy. Because of course mine's dodgy.
Yeah, this has to go to Zoe, doesn't it?
So, considering what I'm into and what I write and what I draw, my moment was, if you've not heard of Le Blue Girl is a hentai anime about secret clan of female sex ninjas that have the power of sexcraft, and an evil clan that made pacts with demons and turned them all into dick monsters. Like literally, like the king of the demons is dick fingers. Now, I was up for most of this, and for most of it I was like, yeah, this is sexy, yeah, this is fun, until in one of the sex scenes, and she's like, no, yes, but no, but... And then I need to think for a moment. I'm really enjoying this, but he might take my sex powers. How am I going to get out of this? Let's really concentrate. Oh my goodness, I've managed to turn my pubes into needles, and I'm now shooting him in the face to kill him. And I was like, wait, do you mean you're, using your pubic hair as, needles to now shoot demons in hell? I'm like, cool, this is the ancient art of sexcraft. I was thinking it might be something a little bit more sexy than badly animated, because the animation is janky. Yeah, that was definitely one of my, okay, yeah, that was a bit random.
There you go.
Follow that. If we're talking comedy horror, I think probably my favourite comedy horror film is Peter Jackson's Bad Taste. Which set the bar for me, and in particular the scene with the sheep and the rocket launcher.
And one on a very similar vein, I can't remember who the director was. I know it was a very low-budget British film called Evil Aliens, and there was a bit with a combine harvester and a row of these aliens going across a field, and it was just set up so beautifully. It was like Python-esque. Splat, and I was roaring with laughter, and everybody else was looking at me like I'd grown a second head. So, yeah, over to you.
I think kind of going back to the Japanese side of things, they do it really well. Some of their gore films, if you've seen films like Machine Girl, have you ever seen them? it's just constant. You're like, what's going on? And you should be horrified by it, but you're really not. There's just, oh my god, they're horrendous, and they're probably the one films that I've actually stopped and been like, oh, okay, and then just burst into laughter and carried on watching. Everyone else was like, what the hell,
Yeah.
I don't really do films or TV, with the exception of cartoons, which I'll give an honourable pass to because my eyeballs can cope with them. But I found The Wasp Factory hilarious.
Well, the thing is, we've discussed that, haven't we, in some of the podcasts, like some of the Lovecraft stories and things like that, and Clark Ashton Smith especially. There are bits in them that have me roaring. Yeah. Right, and on that note, that is the end of this final panel of this year's Innsmouth Literary Festival. I'd like to thank our guests, and thank you all for listening. And yeah, just a reminder, Innsmouth After Dark will be taking place at Bedford Esquires, and doors are 7 p.m. Our first act, Edwardian Tales, will be on at 7:30. Okay, well, I hope to see you all later. Thank you very much.